This is our first genre now. The whole rest of the semester we'll be looking at the genres of the Old Testament and the genres of the New Testament, and then a little bit about application at the end. So we'll start looking briefly on page 50, and then page 51. And again, we're appealing to the concept of literary competence on page 50, about developing the ability to discern clues within the text of the Bible as we read it, or this would be true for any text, but in our case, the text within the Bible that tells you what kind of literature you're dealing with, and hence what to expect and what not to expect from it. And just the goal is for you, and for all those that hopefully you will train, is not to read the Bible mechanically. That when you pick it up, not to read it and say, okay, I need to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. No, that. The goal is to develop informed intuitions, so that when you pick it up to read it and you say, oh, this is an Old Testament narrative, that you would just instinctively, intuitively have informed intuitions. And you don't even have to think about it. As well informed as when you read the newspaper or a website, and a website that might have, let's say, your home page. There might be all kinds of things, news and weather and all these things on it, sports, and you can go from one to the other and shift genres and shift expectations instantly. And you don't think about it. You don't think, okay, I just finished a news story. Oh, there's a headline for a sports story. And all right, now I need to think about this as a sports story, not as a news story. See, you don't think that way, do you? You just intuitively, instantly shift and have appropriate expectations. Well, again, the goal is to get there with the Bible, so wherever you are, whatever you pick it up, and you say, oh, this is a narrative, and that there would be then a bit of information that would well up and be accessible with recognizing what the genre is. And that too would be fairly intuitive or instinctive. Okay? So that's the goal. That's what we're heading toward now as we go through the Old Testament narratives. And there's lots of different kinds of Old Testament narratives, aren't there? There are reports, and we're going to look at one with Solomon. And there are heroic narratives. There's a prophet story, like Jonah, for example. There's even comedy. What would be example, maybe not so much of a whole biblical book, but maybe a subgenre that might be somewhat comedic, be somewhat funny? What can you think of, particularly from the Old Testament? Anything that is subtly humorous?
How about I'm trying to think of his name, I'm sorry, David, the talking donkey?
Balaam, yeah. Yeah, I think that's the first one that comes to my mind, Balaam and his donkey and his talking. I mean, I think that's ironically hilarious, just he's getting drawn into a false prophecy, and angelic being stops him, and he doesn't notice it. The donkey does, and he's beating on the donkey, and the donkey fills him in on what's really going on. So okay. Then there are other things like embedded genres, like speeches and songs and genealogy lists that are embedded things, and proverbs. So lots of different sorts of embedded genres, riddles, fables, parables, all these that are embedded within historical narratives and make it interesting and diverse, don't they? So there's really a lot of things going on here that make for a really interesting reading of the Bible, and especially of these Old Testament narratives. And of course we're going to see the same sorts of things in the Gospels and Acts, aren't we? New Testament narratives. Same sorts of things. Lots of diverse things that are embedded within these Gospels, being historical, theological biographies of sorts. So, yeah, so lots of things interesting, keeps you moving, lots of variety, And it's not just a straight, unbroken narrative by and large. So, again, all these are in your text and are talked about a little more in depth, but our goal is to see them and to recognize them. If we had a little more recognition, for example, of lists, let's say of genealogical lists or genealogical developments, we would have hopefully been a little more understanding about Jabez popping up in a genealogical list and not make quite as much out of the prayer of Jabez that we made if we had proper expectations of what to expect from seeing dear old Jabez pop up in this genealogical list. But given our lack of sensitivity to that, we made a whole lot out of dear old Jabez. So, and then we reap the bitter fruit of it. Okay, let me return some papers. I forgot this. Here's a Proverbs 22:6. Here's Jonah, and here's a couple of leftovers, Joel and Hebrews 6, 1 through 8. Okay, let's talk now specifically about narratives on page 51. As you read, there's three dimensions or perspectives on Old Testament narratives. And one of them is simply the perspective of the individual stories. And these are important. We don't want to lose sight of individuals, but of course if you're a Westerner, I don't have to warn you about losing sight of individuals, because by and large that's all we see in the narratives. We see the narratives as a collection of individual stories. And you want to note this, and you want to attend to it, and you want to appreciate it, and you want to learn from it, because these individuals are models for us, aren't they? And generally positive, but in some cases negative. Some of the things that they do are not godly things. But some of the things they do are godly. Okay, let's just pick one. Gideon, laying out the fleece. The Lord tells him what to do, and he lays out this fleece a couple of different times. Gideon, positive example, negative example. Should we imitate Gideon, and should we put out fleeces, so to speak, metaphorically? You hear Christians say that, or should we not? What think thou, budding hermeneutes? That sounds like a young hermeneutical thing, a hermeneute, like a tadpole or something. No. Okay, hermeneutical, budding hermeneutical scholars. What do you think? Gideon, good example, negative example? Laying out the fleece? Because we use that, we took it as a positive example, didn't we? Is it a positive example? No. What's the example of? Lack of faith, unbelief, isn't it? So, Lord told him to do something, and he's just kind of stalling and kind of wanting this and that, and just needs to kind of be persuaded rather than just step out in faith. So you want to be careful just reading these things. You want to see how it fits in the narrative, and if in fact it's a positive example, or in some cases a negative one. If it's a negative one, then my heavens, don't take it in as a practice that we should be emulating as Christians. And laying out fleeces is a classic example. We weren't particularly discerning on that, were we? So don't overlook the individuals. Again, we don't have to do that, be exhorted as Westerners. But for example, the story of Joseph. You read a little bit about that. We read Joseph's temptation in Genesis 39, and I just got back from a men's conference at my church this weekend, and we didn't talk about Joseph, but a lot of times you do hear about Joseph there in how to deal with sexual temptation. Is he a good model of that? Absolutely. Absolutely. Great example of that with Potiphar's wife, all that. Cost him a few years in prison, but he's still a great example of it. Now, is that all there is to the Joseph story? Oh my heavens, no. That's really just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? There's a whole lot more there. And so you don't want to just read it that way, but that's our tendency. And interestingly enough, when we get to the Gospels, it's our tendency, and when we look at Jesus, in a lot of cases, and to see him as an example of a believer. Now, there's truth to that, but there's a lot more going on in Jesus' life than just being a model of an individual believer, isn't there? He is that for us, but you don't want to stop there, and the same with these. So the next level then would be another perspective would be what this narrative tells us about God's people. And this, of course, is tremendously important for Israel, because this was about their identity. And there were individuals in this, and they became heroes and examples and models in many cases. But this is what is more interesting and important to them would be how what it tells us about their story of the nation, the people, their identity. That's far more important to them. And the individual is interesting, but not as an end in herself or himself, but as a window into who we are as a people and how God worked in our history through these individuals to shape our identity as a people and our heritage. And that's far more interesting and important to them. And so we should be aware of that and move that. For example, with Joseph. Obviously, in terms of the people of God, what's Joseph's role in that? What is his...
The whole nation.
Pardon?
The whole family of the Israelites.
Right. In his generation now, he's a spiritual giant, and essentially his brothers are spiritual pygmies compared to him, aren't they? They were going to kill him, but instead, now he was probably an obnoxious young man, okay, pretty arrogant and all that, and they were going to kill him, but instead they do him a favor by selling him into slavery. And yet, as Joseph says at the end, you intended it for evil, but God, used it for good, didn't he? And so he becomes a vehicle of getting his people into, so to speak, into the womb of Egypt. And here this group of 70 or 75 people come into Egypt, and over the next 400 years, they grow into a nation of about 2.5, 3 million people. And he is the vehicle. So we just don't want to stop at the story of the individual. You want to see what role did that individual play in the history of the nation. And that's immensely important. That's how Israel was saved as a people. If they would have just lived out as a kind of a semi-nomadic people up in the land, first of all, they would have starved to death because there was a famine going on there. And secondly, they would have been easily overpowered by just about every other people group, every other tribal group that had more people, more warriors, and all of that. So, again, you want to see how this individual story plays out in the narrative. And the highest, of course, then is the eternal universal plan of God, how that gets worked out. And obviously in Joseph's case, it sets a pattern of God developing a people, a nation, who the seed of Abraham, so they could be salt and light to all the other nations of the world. And as he would say to them when they were making a commitment to keep the Mosaic covenant, he said, you will be a holy nation. You'll be a nation of priests. And so this is an amazing thing that's going to happen to this nation. So it's important that they have a safe place to grow into a nation from 70, 75 people. And so Joseph is incredibly important and significant in terms of what God's universal plan. And so much so, this whole story is that Jesus, the Messiah, replicates it, doesn't he? He's born in the land and then has to flee to Egypt to keep from getting killed. Now this is with Joseph and Mary taking baby Messiah Jesus there. And then when it's safe, they come back out of the land. And he's kind of replicating Israel's history, isn't he, in doing that? So, yeah, so we want to attend to this. So if you have questions, jump in. I'm going to go on to the next one. Any questions about this? Again, it's being sensitive to, all the dimensions of the narrative. And again, most of us as Westerners, we lock in on that individual level. And not that it's unimportant, but it's not the most important. In some ways, it's the least important. Okay, well, again, if you learn nothing else about narratives, that would be a good one. The second thing would be to emphasize that God is the hero. Doesn't mean he's the main character or the central character, but he is always doing heroic things. With Joseph, it's a classic example, isn't it? Joseph is in prison, and he climbs kind of the ladder through the contacts he makes there with other prisoners. And there's a phrase that keeps getting repeated as he makes these contacts and they remember him and they lift him up. What's the phrase that gets repeated there? Story. Well, the phrase is this: but God blessed him. God gave Joseph favor in the eyes of the baker, in the eyes of the prison, folks over the prison, and ultimately in the eyes of the Pharaoh. God gave Joseph favor. And so God is working. Joseph, in this case, is the main character, but God is the hero and is doing these amazing things in history to help his people accomplish the missions that he has given them. And so we don't want to forget that in any of these narratives, that God is the person. So whenever you're looking at the narrative, you want to step back and say, okay, what does this tell us about God and his actions and his involvement in history? And maybe it will be obvious, like with Joseph and that, through those statements that God gave him favor, or maybe it'll be a bit more subtle. But you don't want to lose out on what God is doing in history and in through these narratives. This is immensely important because, by and large, most Christians believe that God has kind of folded up his tent and slipped away and isn't that involved in history now. And so we need these narratives to persuade us, oh, no, he's very involved in history. And in fact, why wouldn't you think he would be even more involved in history now that Jesus the Messiah has come and inaugurated the whole messianic age? So God's going to be very involved in history. So we need to be persuaded of that, though, that God is still acting heroically in history. He is still doing things. And we need to have eyes to see that, don't we? And the narratives of the Old Testament really help us. They really help move us and stir us and persuade us to that end. A third thing about narratives here is that it's best to take big bites of the narrative. Focus on how these chunks of the story interrelate. It is so easy to get caught up in an individual story within the broader narrative, and we will just kind of see it as a unit in and of itself without any relationship to previous units of the story or following units of the story. And then we try to interpret it just within itself. Let me give an example, not from an Old Testament narrative, but from a gospel. At the men's retreat this weekend, the speaker used a passage as kind of the thematic passage for the weekend. And I didn't think it was a very good thematic passage, but, you know, who am I? That's okay. And this was Jesus healing a blind man in Bethsaida. And this is the only one of his miracles that he did it in two stages. First of all, he spit on his eyes and laid his hands upon them and said, "Do you see anything?" And the blind man looked up and said, "I see men, for I'm seeing them like trees walking about." So, all right. Then again, Jesus laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and restored, and he began to see everything clearly. And Jesus sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Don't even go in there. Okay, well, boy, then one of our questions in the group, we did small groups after each talk, was, why do you think Jesus sent him home and not to the village? And oh boy, we were all over the map, and the speaker was too, actually. Well, because his first talk was on your family and all that, and so, You know, he probably wanted him to go home and minister to his family. You know, he had probably been neglecting them. You know, he was blind, and maybe he had overlooked them. You know, hadn't seen them. Yeah, that's pretty good. And so probably Jesus looked intently into his eyes and said, now you go home and you take care of your family. Don't go in the village. You know, your priority is to minister to your family at home and all that. Okay. We all have the map. And so all these conjectures by the guys in the group, well, I think maybe this, maybe that, maybe that. The fact is, we really don't know, do we, within the narrative itself. But you just look at the next chunk, the next passage is the great thing where Jesus takes his disciples and even up in the Gentile territory, up in Caesarea Philippi, and he says, who do the people say that I am? Oh, John the Baptist, one of the prophets, this and that. Who do you say that I am? Peter blurts out, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, absolutely right. Father in heaven revealed that to you. Now don't tell anybody about it. Well, wow. Why? Well, the last 6 months of his ministry, Jesus is going to add one more aspect to his identity as the Messiah. And he begins it that very day when he tells the disciples, don't tell anybody who I am. What's the one thing he's got to add to his identity as a Messiah? Last 6 months of his ministry, he's going to pound this home with his disciples. What is that? He's going to suffer and die as the Messiah at the hands of the religious who's who of Israel. Yeah, I'm going to suffer and die, be buried, be raised again. That's a part of my identity as the Messiah. And I don't want you going out blabbing about me being the Messiah until you understand fully my identity as the Messiah at this time. That as the Messiah, I'm going to suffer and die for our sins and be raised again, newness of life. And if he tells his disciples not to go out and blab about it, all the information they have, that it certainly would be understandable why he told this blind man who's now has sight, don't go out and blab about it. Because what it would have started would be a popular movement, wouldn't it? Oh, Jesus is miracle worker and all this and that. And they would have then, let's make him king, let's make him king. And they'd already tried to do that once before when he fed the 5,000 in the wilderness. Let's make him king. And the Romans would have come in and slaughtered hundreds of unarmed people probably because of starting this popular movement. And it would have been an inappropriate identity of Jesus in his first coming, where he comes as the suffering servant, doesn't he? And so you don't know, when you're reading that one little narrative about the blind man, you don't really know the reason because it's not given within that. But contextually, when you go to the next story, and then you can see, oh, gosh, there's probably an interrelationship between these two chunks. And it makes sense why Mark doesn't tell us. It makes all the sense in the world because Jesus was adding to his identity and he didn't want an incomplete message to be proclaimed about him. So that's important. Take big bites of the narrative and interrelate the chunks of the narrative to one another. And because the writers of the narrative, and the Holy Spirit included, know that you should interpret narratives this way, that they won't tell you everything within each individual pericope or episode of the narrative. They won't tell you everything you need to know, because you will either know things from the previous part of the narrative about what's important in there, or if you keep reading, you will learn things afterwards and you'll understand why this happened in the previous episode or two. Does that make sense to you? So this is important to understand about narrative literature, be it in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. Big picture, see how the parts relate to one another. Luke 16, 1 to 13, your passage you're going to study. It's in a narrative. It's a parable, but it's in a narrative. Look and see how it fits in to the narrative. Okay? That'll give you eyes to see what's important about it. Okay, questions about that? This is... Oh, gosh, I love teaching this time of year. It's so much fun. Okay, here we go. Oh, point number 4 about Old Testament. Yeah. And
I have a question it's more situational.
okay, and I'm glad you're drinking a Diet Coke, Nanette, because it's giving you some caffeine here. This is good.
Sprinkle it over the room.
Yeah.
When you're in a situation like that, in a men's retreat,
Yeah.
and the pastor was
It was a pastor,
Or
yeah, outsider.
A speaker.
Yeah.
Who's leading the
Yeah.
and all of us in this room are in situations like that in our churches.
Yes.
But we're getting this really good training. I mean, do you just sit there and
Yes.
you just zip it and you don't
Yes.
contribute what you know about this passage of scripture that they're talking about? Or
Sometimes, and then I go outside and bang my head against a tree or something too. That helps.
There's a lot you have to offer.
Well, okay.
I know that feeling. But
That's why the
is there ever a time when you do?
Yes, there was.
contribute?
We had this discussion 2 or 3 times in the first time in a small group, and I didn't say anything. And then we didn't really touch it in the second time. Then in our third and last group, it came up again. And so I just opened and looked at the narrative a little more closely, and I saw the next incident, and then I just threw that in. I said, and I wasn't heavy-handed about it. I said, why did Jesus tell him to go home and not to the village? I said, here's my guess. All right? Here's my guess, that it's because he had an incomplete knowledge of who Jesus is. All he knew about Jesus was that he is a miracle worker, and he healed him. And that is a part of Jesus' identity. But he didn't know and hadn't been privy to the other part. So, but yeah, so I said it, and then we got into kind of interesting dialogue about that. So, there's a time and a place. But the first time or two, I didn't say it. I just sat there, and we just let it roll. And so, yeah, it takes wisdom. And I think what's important is to feel like you don't have to say everything. And there are times that we just shouldn't say it, even though it might be helpful to some folks. But it's just, we shouldn't have to say it just because we know it. And that becomes about our character and about our neediness. And so I think there's times just to sit on things, just to sit on your lips. Just not appropriate, not say anything. And certainly be careful about saying things in a group, publicly. It's always better, if it's the leader that has said something, or somebody in the group, it's always better to talk to them privately. That's just, it can be shameful and embarrassing in front of a group. So it's always better to do it one-on-one. So, but again, a lot of times I don't say anything. And I'm sitting there, once I get over my gnashing my teeth, saying, Lord, do you want me to say something or not? But it's taken a long time to get to the point that I don't have to say something to feel okay about myself. I don't have to do it. That I can be open-handed and let the Lord guide me. Because sometimes I might say it, to build myself up, rather than to edify the group, whatever. So, yeah, but that's a hard one. It really is. Another point here, and I want to temper this, okay? Old Testament narratives do not equal a vehicle for my story, and usually we do that via allegorizing, nor are they a vehicle for a psychological study that's primarily about us. We'll talk, those are two different things, we'll talk about it. A lot of times you hear speakers speak about an Old Testament narrative, and they will turn it on its head and make it about us. Let me give an example. A few years ago in the Biola chapel, a guest speaker came in and was talking about Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem from the book of Nehemiah. And so they said, okay, Nehemiah comes there, and one of the first things they have to do is to clear out the rubble from the old wall that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed before they can begin to build a new wall. All right? And then, just like that, the speaker allegorized the narrative and said, this is what it's teaching us. Before God can do a new work in your life, He has to clear out the rubble from your past mistakes and your past sin. Now, we're so used to that, it sounds plausible, doesn't it? Because it's about us. Suddenly now, boom, we're a lot more engaged in the story, aren't we? It's about us. It's about me. And so I'm thinking about, okay, what is one of the new things that God may have been kind of prodding me that He wants to do now, but what is the rubble that I need to clear away first before He can do this? See? Then it's all about us, isn't it? And we're in our own head, our own life, and we've individualized it, and we've made it, my story, and we're seeing ourselves in the narrative. We're like a wall, and we've got rubble, and all that sort of thing. And the walls are going to be the new thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, what do you get from doing that to Scripture? What do you get? What's the payoff? Why? Because there must be a payoff, because people do that all the time with Old Testament narratives. They allegorize them. What do you get from that particular example?
Start to see the Bible as my understanding.
All right. Start to see the Bible as
me.
As me.
As
All right.
me.
Yeah. I'm right in the middle of it. It's okay.
I guess you could be tempted to just come up with a good point that you think is a good point, and then find an allegory, any kind of story that you could.
Yeah. And that's what happens a lot of times. People have something they want to talk about, and so then they look, they have a message in search of a biblical passage to, be their vehicle to illustrate that what they're going to say, whatever they're going to say anyway, and they just need a passage to be their vehicle, whether the passage teaches it or not. So what you get in this case is it's probably a true thing. It's probably a true thing. Sometimes for God to do a new work, He has to convict us of sin and things that might hinder that new work. Could be. That well may be a true thing. Of course, it's not in that passage. It's not there. And so that's confusing to people to come up with a truth and an application, a principle that actually isn't in the biblical passage. So that's confusing to people, first of all. And there will be people sitting there saying, gee, I've read Nehemiah several times, and that thought never occurred to me. I must be slow or thick or spiritually insensitive or whatever. Of course, my response is, oh no, it's not your fault, because it's not there, Wonderful things in your words I see, most of them put there by you and me, that sort of thing. But it's not edifying to people because what this is doing, we talked about this last time, the speaker is inappropriately individualizing and privatizing a historical narrative, and is not working within the confines of what a historical narrative is. But they're looking for something spiritual, a spiritual principle that kind of is hovering over above the narrative, see? But to get to that spiritual principle, you have to allegorize the narrative in order to get to that. And of course, unless you're sitting there and allegorizing the narrative and making it your story, you're not going to be seeing the same thing in the Bible that the speaker is seeing. And so again, that's confusing to folks sitting there looking at their Bibles, and I think it's essentially demeaning to them because they always give the benefit of the doubt. Well, this person knows more than I know. They're educated. This is what they do. All of that, and so they must be right and I must be wrong because I'm sure not getting that out of it. So I guess I just don't know how to read the Bible very well. That's not edifying, is it? That's not encouraging to God's people. But what you get in this case is kind of a people helping thing, okay? But it's okay. I wouldn't say it's a great insight, but it's an okay thing, and that's what we want. We want these things about you and me that are tell me how to be successful or how to do this or how to do that, and so we make the Bible, as a lot of Christian writers have said, and publicly, the Bible is the greatest self-help book ever written. Wow, okay, so then let's interpret it like a self-help book, and that's kind of a self-help sort of application, isn't it? So that's what you get out of it, kind of a second-rate people-helping thing, self-help thing. But what do you lose from Nehemiah in a story? What do you lose if we just allegorize it and make it all about our story? What do you lose? Yeah, you lose the intention of the author. Okay, yeah, we lose that. But what is the story telling us? What is this narrative telling us?
Well, like you were saying, if I could go to stealing anything, but like the third dimension that's the highest priority is that there's the work that God is doing in history to
Right.
restore a nation in which was to be a witness for God.
Yeah.
Nothing more to do with God doing a work.
Right.
for the nation.
And that nation is not going to make it if its capital city doesn't have a wall around it, does it? Okay? So, what is Nehemiah's historical mission that God has given him? What is his mission in history and in the nation of Israel's history and in the story of God's kingdom and his purposes and universal purpose and plan? Well, he's given a very specific historical mission, isn't it? Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. That's his mission. And what we see is, in Nehemiah, there was a lot of opposition to it, wasn't there? There was a lot of subterfuge going on. There was, the Samaritans and others. There was trickery. And Nehemiah needed great skill and great anticipation and a great wisdom in figuring out how to accomplish this historical mission that God had given him in light of all the opposition, some within the camp, some outside of the camp. Okay? Now, what's the relevance and significance to us then as we read that? As we look at Nehemiah and his historical mission, what he was supposed to do? What should we derive from that? Well, have we been given a historical mission? Oh yeah. It's the grandest one up to this point in history, isn't it? Go and make disciples of all the people groups. There's 24,000 of them, 8,000 of them still unreached. Now, as we go about this climactic historical mission, do you think there will be opposition? Do you think there'll be subterfuge? Do you think there'll be all kinds of threats and things? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so we can be encouraged and envisioned and strengthened by the story of Nehemiah because we see God working in and with and through him in history and God's people showing great faith and wisdom and skill in carrying out the historical mission. Now that's what we desperately need, isn't it? Because that strengthens our worldview, that God is at work in the world. And He's not up there, but He's down here involved with us in and with and through our historical mission. Let me give you an example. Last week, on Wednesday or Thursday, a book, Playing with Fire, that you're reading was presented in Taiwan. It was translated into traditional Chinese. And our partner over there, Jane, was speaking at a conference and doing interviews about it. And so what happens when a tool to try to help people read the Bible better that doesn't exist in Taiwan, in traditional Chinese, when it's created, what happens? Ooh, opposition. So what happens with Jane? Well, her dad flips out, and he has all kinds of spiritual, mental things going on, and the devil knows. And she said in an email to us, this is where I'm vulnerable. My dad, when he has problems and he gets suicidal or angry or bitter, depressed, whatever, that really is a way to discourage me. So she had that on her end. What do we have on our end? Well, we had this lawsuit, potential lawsuit, $1,250 payout, which didn't necessarily have. And then the next day, I get a call from a guy, and he said, I just got a check from Lifting Hands Network for $1,278, and then I'm supposed to, it's part of a marketing survey research thing, I'm supposed to then wire $800 to this person, and then I'll make $478 on it. And I said, well, let me just tell you, thank you for calling Lifting Hands Network. It's our home. Our home phone is on there. But you just got scammed because we didn't send you a check. And this is some kind of a illegal, multi-level, Ponzi scam, whatever. And you go to the FBI, go to the police, whatever. So I go up to the bank, and put a freeze on our account. And it's just a messy thing, and this is the second time in the last 5 months that our account has been hacked into, and they've used it. People have either taken money out or written checks on it, whatever. And he gave us the number on the check, and it was the bank number and our account number. It was all there, so they had inside information about it. So we were able to deal with that, we think. But again, it's just another one of those pecking oppositional things. See, 2 things within 2 or 3 days. Is that coincidence? Maybe. Is it spiritual warfare and opposition? Probably. Is God at work in the midst of that to help us, to strengthen us so that we would be wise and move on with this? Because we're going to spend 3.5 weeks in Taiwan in January trying to get the word out about good hermeneutics there. Should we be encouraged by Nehemiah? Yes. Yes. But if I make Nehemiah my story and make it all about me, then there's no encouragement there, is there? About God's work in the world, in the midst of His people, to accomplish the historical mission that God has given His people. That's a big price to pay, isn't it? For kind of a second-rate self-help, sort of a thing that you could get a lot of places. So, all right. So be careful about using the Old Testament narratives as my story. Secondly, be careful about psychologizing the narratives. Okay, now, I am not against psychology, okay? I believe in psychology. Some of my best friends are psychologists, okay? We encouraged our daughter, our firstborn, to be a psychology major at Biola, which she was. I have given a lot of money to psychologists, for help, therapy. So I am not anti-psychology, all right? So hear me on this. What I am against is reading those psychology into the Bible, especially in group-oriented peoples, and especially, peoples that ancient Near East or the Mediterranean world. Let me tell you a little story that happened just across the hall here a few years ago in the men's room, in the restroom. All right, ladies, bear with me here. I'm going to give you some insights into the world of men. Okay. Guys, back me up on this, all right? When a man steps into the men's room, there's several mores or several great truths that guide our behavior in the men's room, right? Okay, ladies, I'll share with a few of them. One of them is you're not eyeballing other guys, are you? You see somebody it's, hi, Catch. It's not, hi, Catch. No, you're not eyeballing, right? You don't eyeball other guys in the men's room, okay? Secondly, you don't do a lot of talking and chatting in the men's room, right? No, hey. And usually you don't say anything to anybody, especially if you don't know them. You're not chatting them up, right? Is this fair, guys? Am I making this up? Of course, the question is, where did we learn all this? Does somebody just say, all right, now here's how you behave in the men's room? You just pick it up, don't you? All right. Thirdly, spacing is very important in the men's room, isn't it? Okay. All right. So if there's a guy there, you don't stand next to him. If you could stand here or here or here, right? General rule of thumb, you get as far away as you can. Is that fair? Okay, where did we learn this? Did somebody do? No, you just learned it, don't you? Okay, it's kind of instinctive. All right, so I'm in the restroom, and one of our TH students comes up to me and breaks multiple mores at once, okay. He said, first of all, he eyeballs me, okay. Okay, hi, yeah, looking away. He said, hey, you planted a church with such and such in Baltimore, didn't you? Yeah, I did. And it's great talking to you, Let me wash my hands here. Hey, and he said, no, wait, really, I got to tell you this. And I just heard a tape that he did at a Dallas Seminary Pastors Conference. I said, yeah, I heard he was speaking there. He said, it's one of the most unbelievable things I've ever heard. It's really incredible. I said, well, that's great. Glad you enjoyed it. And he's a really great speaker, so I'll see you later. No, wait. Wait, he was talking about why Moses struck the rock in the wilderness. I said, oh, really? That's an interesting story, isn't it? So, Well, thanks. I'll see you a little bit later. No. Wait a minute. And here's what was so fantastic part about it. He asked me, do you know why Moses struck the rock in the wilderness? All right, here's what's going on inside. I thought, okay, that's it. I've had enough of this. I don't feel comfortable talking to anybody in the restroom, and so I got to get out of here as fast as I can. So let me think of the weirdest, strangest, funkiest, craziest thing to say to him. He asked me, do you know why Moses struck the rock in the wilderness? So I thought for a moment, had all these things, thinking, got to get out of here, I got to get out of here. So I said, sure, I know why he struck the rock in the wilderness, because he had a bad relationship with his father. His mouth flew open. He said, how did you know? You see, my friend had preached about Moses striking the rock in the wilderness, and he psychologized the story, and he said it's because he had a bad relationship with his father. He preached that to, I don't know, 200, 300, 400 Dallas seminary graduates that were pastors, and by the way, at that moment, the leaders determined they would never invite him to do anything again, and they haven't. And additionally, he had his own issues with his dad. His dad died when he was 16, and his mother was alcoholic, and there was just all kinds of pain in the family and all that. And so he was reading some of that into this Old Testament narrative and psychologizing it. And we really don't know what was going on in Moses' head about his father and all that. So we don't know why he did it. What we do know is the impact of doing it. And that cost him entrance into the promised land, didn't it? And what was the reason? Why did God say, when you struck the rock in the wilderness, this is why you're not going in the land? What was it? He struck it twice. And what was the reason? God said, well, you shamed me in front of the congregation. That's what the story is about. We don't know Moses' motivation. He was impatient. Maybe he had a bad day. All of that. But we don't really know, do we? And so it's inappropriate to psychologize and to read these things into the narrative. First of all, these are group-oriented people. Their view of relationships with parents is totally different than a modern Western view, and all of this, blah, 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 blah. So we don't want to make a narrative our story, and we don't want to psychologize it, okay? But we do that all the time in the West. And again, then what we cover over is what the narrative really is saying and the main point of it, and what it tells us about God and His work in the world and how He wants to work in and through His people and those sort of things. We lose those. Questions about this? Okay, this is, again, it's very, very easy to do this with narratives. It's very easy to do. They just almost beg to be misinterpreted. Okay, last point about Old Testament narratives. They're not a treasure chest of morals or success principles. And again, as Americans, we're always looking for pragmatic, kind of self-help success things. We kind of almost pull everything through that little keyhole. And so I get advertisements in the mail about local churches. Maybe they're starting up or maybe they're trying to grow. And I get these really nice flyers, and it says, come here, Pastor such and such. He's starting a 5-week series on how to have success in your business from Joshua chapters 3 and 4 and 5. Really? Okay, I think that's about the conquest of the land and the killing of people in Jericho and then the defeated Ai and all of that. Okay, so these are going to be success principles for your business. So what are we supposed to kill them? Business jihad? Okay, you know what is this? See, would you expect to have success principles, you know, for your business, your marriage, or whatever, from an Old Testament narrative? Is that the purpose of the narrative? Are those things kind of embedded in there? You know, you see, that's again, pulling Scripture through kind of a pragmatic, success-oriented keyhole and distorting it. And it's not what you get. What you may get, there might be wisdom in it, whatever, but it's what you lose. You lose what those passages are actually teaching us, what they tell us about God and His people and all that. So please work hard with Old Testament narratives. Read the whole story, the biblical book you're working in, see how the parts fit together, and then you will know what to emphasize and the significance of each of those narratives. And you will have something to give to God's people and to yourself that will be from the Lord about how He is working in the world, how He's involved, and how He wants to use you and the rest of us in our historical mission, what we're supposed to do. So, okay, any questions about that? We're going to segue here and talk about 2 Chronicles. Again, boy, these are really easy to do, these things. Okay, let's look at 2 Chronicles. And let's work our way down to the narrative by starting at the top and work our way down to this passage. Okay, starting up at the top, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they're a history of Israel in light of her worship of Yahweh, the living God. And particularly, there's an emphasis on the temple in there, and especially there's a focus on Judah, since when the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes split into Israel and Judah, that the focus shifts to Judah because she is more faithful. Of course, that's where Jerusalem, the temple is, and all that. Within then that big picture of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, in 2nd Chronicles 1 through 9, we have a history of Solomon. And, he gets a lot of ink here because he and David, obviously, were the 2 greatest kings of Israel. And so he gets 9 chapters. What's interesting then, because of the interest in the chroniclers on the temple, the focus on the temple is, of those 9 chapters, chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 5 out of the 9 are about the construction of the temple. And it's what we call a construction report, all right? Now remember, Solomon's father David has spent years and years and years collecting the materials, and Solomon simply completes that collection and then brings about the construction of it. So then within those 5 chapters of the temple construction report, we get 1 chapter, the last one, in this, of the temple dedication report. And so the whole thing is about this amazing day when they dedicate the temple. Now, since Mount Sinai, we're roughly 500 years into the history of Israel after Sinai. So this is a huge event in the history of the nation, isn't it? That God, His presence had been identified with the tent, the tabernacle, a temporary building, a building appropriate for in the wilderness and that, but they've lived in the land now for several hundred years, and God was in, still His presence was located in this tent, and there were even times that elements of that were stolen by the Philistines. You remember that? Carried away, and then they had all kinds of problems, health problems and spiritual problems because of that, and so then they gave it back. But here, David, and now Solomon, lives in this incredible, beautiful palace, and God's presence was located in a tent. So David before, and now Solomon completes the building of the temple. So this is a huge event in the history of the nation of Israel. And in particular then, after some explanation of Solomon's prayer and the dedication of the temple and all the sacrifices in that, then that night, after he had done what he wanted to do, then there is what we call an epiphany. The Lord appears to him, and this is the account then in verses 11 through 22. Now, of course, what we're working up to is verse 14. Let me begin in verse 11 of 2 Chronicles chapter 7. Thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's palace, and successfully completed all that he planned on doing in the house of the Lord and in his palace. All right? Finish those 2 things. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon at night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. All right? So far, so good. Here we go. Verse 11. If I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people, and my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. And that's what we latch on to from this account, isn't it? So, verses 13 and 14 are really interesting to us. All right, now, there's some key words in here, and what's important is to kind of see where they come from. God says to him, if I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people. These are three things that get mentioned here. Now, is this the first time Solomon, people of Israel, hear this? Is this new news? No, it's not new news. It's very old news, isn't it? Where have we heard these things before? Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 28. Moses speaking to the new generation. Mom and dad died in the wilderness because of their unbelief, and so Moses is going through the Mosaic Law in a very exhortive way, a series of long exhortive sermons to say, this is how you're to live out the covenant now that your parents agreed to. You were kids, but now you need to own it as adults. This is the covenant that you have with the living God, the Mosaic covenant. And probably didn't call it that. We call it that, the old covenant, now that we have a new one. But in chapter 28, what's really interesting is there are these broad sweeping blessings. Look at it, they only give 14 verses to the blessings and 54 verses to the curses. So the blessings are very general, broad sweeping. They're incredible blessings, but the curses are real specific. And let me pick up in the curses part, verse 21. The Lord will make the pestilence cling to you until he has consumed you from the land when you are entering to possess it. Verse 24, the Lord will make the rain of your land powder and dust. From heaven it shall come down on you until you are destroyed. Now these are all if they disobey. And then verse 38, and you shall bring out much seed to the field, but you shall gather in little, for the locusts shall consume it, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so we've already heard about the rain, no rain, the locusts, and the pestilence, and a whole bunch of other things. What is the ultimate discipline from the Lord of the hand? I mean, there's these sorts of things that affects their food and their water supply. Then there's the whole thing of other nations that God will use as a goad, as a poke thing, poking them to obey. What's the ultimate curse that they will experience? All right, they'll be taken out of the land. Does that occur in our passage? Yes, it does. Verse 19. But if you turn away and forsake my statutes, now we're back in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 19. But if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot you from my land, which I have given you, and this house, which I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all peoples, etc., etc., etc. Wow. That's pretty amazing. Now, what's the significance of God communicating this to Solomon on the night or shortly thereafter the dedication of the temple? This thing that they've spent 2 generations gathering the things and then building it is the most magnificent building Israel has ever seen. What's the significance of communicating, God communicating this to Solomon in an epiphany, in an appearance on this occasion, the temple dedication? What's going on here?
It's nice that they did this. He calls this their house of sacrifice, but it doesn't change the terms of his covenant.
All right, absolutely right. This house is great. It's a place of sacrifice. It is a place that symbolically my presence is there in the midst of you. But you know what? When all is said and done, it's not about this fancy house. It's not about this fancy temple. What it's about is your covenant relationship with me as the living God. That is infinitely more important than this fancy place. And it's so important that if you're unfaithful in your covenantal relationship with me, I will destroy this house that you spent 2 generations collecting the stuff, and you spent, in our terms, millions and millions and millions of dollars on. I'll destroy it. And it will become not a place of my presence, but the peoples of the world will pass by, and it will be a proverb or a byword that, wow, boy, that people's God, the people of Israel's God, wasn't very nice to them, were they? Wonder what they did to make him angry. Yeah, they were unfaithful. They were spiritually wandered away from his covenant. See that? It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Pretty amazing passage. The timing of it as to what matters with God is not the fancy building, although he will honor it and his presence will be there for a time, but it was the covenant. That encouraging? Okay. Here's the punchline. Can American Christians or Korean Christians or Indonesian Christians or Chinese Christians or Haitian Christians or any Christians in any nations, can they claim the promise of 2 Chronicles 7:14 is a promise for America or for their nation? And by the way, there are other countries doing this too. Another one of our American Christian exports. Can we use this verse as a thematic verse for the National Day of Prayer? I'm a little late in asking that question. We've been doing that for 25, 30, no, longer than that, almost 40 years. It's okay to use it for that? It's a promise, and people claim it as a promise. If my people, who's that today? When we claim this, who are my people? Believers in this country. Okay, if my people in this country, okay, if they will humble themselves and pray, then I will hear from heaven, and I will heal their land. Okay, what land is that? The lands, the churches and the Christian buildings, that land, including the homes of the Christians, their land, they own it. Guess we'll include you if you're renting too. We'll throw that in. Okay. Or is it the whole nation? Oh, it's the whole nation, isn't it? So some of us, the Christians, if we humble ourselves and pray, then God will heal the whole land. Wow, what are the problems with that? I don't see any problems. I think it's a pretty good deal. Yeah, what are the problems with that? Okay.
Why is it just our land?
Okay.
I mean, why just our country?
Why just our country? Because we're special, Ken. We're special. We're the new Israel.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, we're very special. That's a part of our glasses as American Christians, isn't it?
What about
would people that do this though really say that it's only about America? Or, I mean, they would say that any country.
Any country. Christians, there are Christians all over the world now that are beginning to pray this for their country, claim this promise.
America is special.
Yeah, but no, that's why we say, I mean, we started it, and so because a part of our heritage is we believe this is a God-ordained nation similar, part 2, to Israel. That's kind of a part, manifest destiny and all this, sort of thing. So it is kind of a unique part of the American Christian glasses. American glasses and Christians, we've adopted that. But now other countries are adopting it too.
As an example of that, I've seen a room full of Spanish pastors on their knees crying out to God because of their history of the Inquisition
Right.
and the Counter-Reformation, where the
Right.
Spirit of God has never had a major movement
Right.
with Christianity in Spain.
Yeah.
And they,
Yeah.
with all good intention and with very
Right.
heavy hearts, believe
Yeah.
that historically the nation has turned their face against
Right.
the one true God, and they are crying out with this scripture they're
All
using
right.
it in the same
Right.
way because they believe
Right.
in it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So it has to do with their kind of unique history too. Okay. Give me 3 good reasons why we should not claim this for any Christians in any country around the world. Claim it for your nation. 3 good reasons.
We have to claim the warnings too then, right?
Pardon?
We have to claim the warnings too then.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, just in fairness, we ought to say, okay, here's the blessing part of it. Now, how about the cursing part of it? If you don't do this, then you're going to get exiled from your country. No. We just want the positive. We don't want the negative side. Oh, okay. We just want the first 2 or 3 verses. We don't want later on in the paragraph. Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, so if you're going to do this, you got to tell them both sides. Healing or ultimately expulsion from the land. All right? Exile. All right?
We don't have the covenant relationship.
Oh my, it's not our covenant. It was God's covenant with a theocratic state of Israel. My people and the land, pretty well the same, wasn't it? All that together. It's a theocratic state. It's the former covenant. It's the Mosaic covenant. It's not our covenant. We're under the new covenant. And I got a word for you describing the new covenant compared to the old. Better. Better. That's a key word of Hebrews, 13, 14 times? Better, 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 better. So why are you going back to an old covenant that's not our covenant? It's God's covenant with the theocratic state of Israel. Why are you claiming Israel's promises for your country?
Because God actually told Solomon not to. He actually told Solomon, right? But he's directly disclosed to Solomon, not to anyone else.
Okay, yeah, it was close to Solomon, not to, to us, but it was about God's people then, not His people now. Additionally, is this the kind of work that God is doing now? Is this the Great Commission? What does this have to do with the Great Commission? If Christians are going to give themselves to trying to save their land and their country and get into mixing kind of the political and the spiritual together in different ways, doesn't that get murky? Doesn't that change kind of our mission, what we're supposed to be about? You ought to think about that a little bit. It sure does. Might we, in trying to save this land or whatever land you're in, a Christian's trying to save that, might that cause you to veer off of task as to what we're supposed to be about? Yes, it really could do that, mightn't it? Multiple problems with this, folks. It's misusing an Old Testament narrative. It really is, and it does great harm to the Word of God. Great harm to it. Go and sin no more with Old Testament narratives, okay? Read them like we're supposed to, according to the genre.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.